Welcome to Delegate to the Top, abusing Kerberos for arbitrary impersonations and remote code execution. Delegation is the assignment of authority to another person to carry out specific activities. It is one of the core concepts of management leadership. While delegation is being used, and it's a very powerful and effective feature, if you delegate too much, it could lead for devastating results. Computer security is not different, and the fact is that delegation is very risky. While it's being used in almost every enterprise, not many really knows how it works. So if you're on the defensive side, you should know the implications of using delegation, and if you're on the offensive side, you should add delegation to your hacking arsenal, since it enables many escalation opportunities which will stay under the radar. So my name is Matan Hart. I'm a security researcher at CyberArk. Previously, I was a forensic investigator and a malware analyst in the Israeli Air Force and the Israeli Defense Forces. But now my focus is on Kerberos and Active Directory security. You might disagree with me, but I think that PowerShell is the best scripting language in Windows today. And if you didn't notice yet, I'm a huge fan of the TV show Mr. Robot. So in this presentation, I'll explain what is delegation and how it's been performed in Windows networks. We will deep dive into the different delegation types and configurations that are available in the Windows Active Directory and discuss the limitations and the security risks they introduce. Using a tool I've built and a demo, I will show how an attacker can impersonate another user and escalate privileges, and then maybe even get remote code execution through unintended services. Finally, I will share some guidance and defense strategies to detect and mitigate malicious delegation activity. But let's just start with the problem. Double hop is the act of maintaining credentials between two or more connections. In the typical scenario, when a user accesses a server, such as a web service, and that web service needs to access a remote resource, such as a database, in order to retrieve data back to the user, the front-end service will use its own credentials to access that resource. Those credentials are basically the account which runs under the front-end service. This imposes two limitations which are very problematic. First, there is no way to audit who is the first user who accessed and retrieved the data from the resource, because the front end will be logged as the account who took that information from that resource. Another problem is that sometimes this resource needs to be accessed by the original user to comply with several restrictions and authorization rules. Kerberos delegations solves this problem by allowing the front-end service to obtain Kerberos tickets on behalf of the user and access with them to act on behalf of the user and access the resource. So when the resource get those tickets, you'll authorize and get and be accessed by the user himself. Unconstrained delegation was the first delegation that introduced back in Windows 2000, and it allowed the user to the front-end service to fully impersonate the user to access the resource. It required two things. First, the user has to forward his own ticket running ticket to the front end to reuse it. And second, the front end has to be trusted for delegation in the domain controller. Let's look how it's looked behind the scenes. If you are not very familiar with Kerberos, it's fine, you will get there. So first, the user obtains a forward ticket running ticket using his own ticket running ticket. Basically, it's the same ticket, but now he has the forwarded flag, which allows him to forward it to the front end. then the client will receive another ticket to access the front end. Then the client will generate a session key, encrypts the ticket granting ticket, and put that session key inside the service ticket. The client then presents those two tickets to the front end, so the front end is being able to decrypt the service ticket with his own key, extract the session key, and then decrypt the ticket granting ticket. When the front end have this ticket, it can go to the domain controller and ask for service tickets on behalf of the user. The domain controller checks if the front-end service is trusted for delegation, and if he does, he brings back a service ticket to the front end to access the resource. And finally, the front-end service uses the ticket to access the resource and act on behalf of the user. The Kerberos unconstrained delegation has two major limitations. First is only can be used with Kerberos because the client has to move his ticket running ticket to the front end. So if the client is outside of the domain or you are using a different kind of authentication, such as token RSA, you won't be able to delegate access. Another issue is that the Kerberos unconstrained delegation is a black and white kind of delegation, full impersonation or no impersonation at all. And there is no way to restrict the access and make least privileges with this kind of delegation. The only way to limit access is to mark specific users to not be trusted for delegation, which means there is no specific way you can delegate access to a specific service for that user. Also, if you compromise the front-end server, you can easily use tools such as Mimikatz to obtain those cached ticket running tickets that the front end already received. So basically, the unconstrained delegation is already considered to be unsafe. This is why Microsoft introduced in Windows 2003 the constrained delegation, which allowed delegation to specific services and limit the exposure that is done by the unconstrained delegation. It does so by extending the Kerberos protocol with two new extensions, the service for user to self and the service for user to proxy. Using the service for user to self, it solves the first problem of being able to use only Kerberos by allowing the front-end service to acquire a service ticket to itself on behalf of the user. And using the service for user to proxy, the service can use a service ticket and obtain additional service tickets to access the resource, instead of using the original ticket running ticket in the unconstrained delegation. So basically, the constrained delegation has major advantages. First, in the security aspect, it's now able to make a granular kind of delegation and restrict the access to specific services, which limit the exposure of the delegation. It also is not required to forward the whole ticket running ticket to the front end, which means it's safer. In the usability aspect, it's also improved because there's now support to protocol transition, so we can use another kind of authentication protocol and then access the resource using delegation and Kerberos. The only downside in the constrained delegation is that it's limited to a single domain, so the front end and the back end needs to be at the same domain. So let's look how it's been seen behind the scenes. So first, the client authenticates to the front end using a non-Kerberos authentication, because we can use protocol transition. Then the front end uses the service for user to self extension to acquire a service ticket on behalf of the user to himself. Later, with that ticket, we can use the service for user to proxy to obtain additional service tickets to access the backend. And finally, with that ticket, we can access the resource to act on behalf of the user. There is one scenario which was problematic for me. In that case, there are basically no communication between the client and the domain controller at all. So I was curious to know how the domain controller is being able to verify that the client is legitimate and is really authenticated to the front-end service. So I read in the Microsoft documentations, and I found out that it basically does not. The domain controller fully trusts the front-end service to authenticate the user. And basically, that front-end needs to supply only the username in order to impersonate the user, which means it can impersonate whoever he wants. Don't worry, I didn't invent something. It's a feature Microsoft invented. It's not a bug, which allows the front-end service to make any kind of arbitrary impersonations in order to get access to the allowed service. So it's also not going to be changed soon because it's an expected behavior Microsoft implemented. However, Microsoft does mention that the combination of the service for user to self and the service for user to proxy allows to the services that allowed for delegation a degree of power which is similar to the domain controller itself. At that moment, I was curious to see how we can leverage this kind of authentication and maybe gain more than what it's expected to have. So let's see how those services are being restricted in the Kerberos consent delegation. So service principal names uniquely identifies a service in the domain, and they are used by the Kerberos protocol to map and associate a service to a service logon account. And without them, Kerberos is unable to issue service tickets. Those service principal names basically contains the service type on a specific server, and they sometimes even can provide a port. Some examples of those service principal names are HTTP for web services, SMTP and POP3 for mail services, and CIFS for printing and file sharing. But basically, there are many, many SPNs that you can use. Those services that are trusted for delegation are running under an account which has been configured to use delegation. You can configure this account, whether it's a computer or a user, in the Active Directory and set the service principal names that are allowed for delegation. You can configure this configuration only by a domain administrator, and this account must be associated with a service principal name. In order to enable protocol transitioning, you also need to set the account to act as part of the operation system, which by default is only granted to the system account. So now that we know how delegation works and how you can configure it, I started to think how it's possible to gain this account and then use it to make malicious activity. But first, we need these privileges. So let's see how it's possible to get this account in the network. So defer those accounts from the standard user accounts in your network because they're easily discovered through the Active Directory. You just need to filter those accounts and then check where the service principal is located so you know the servers that are using. They're also very accessible and exposed by the service that they host. So if it's a web service and you have some kind of exploitation to IIS, you might get this account as well. Because there's some kind of a service accounts, they are usually unmanaged with no password policy and whatever, and they're often neglected. So it's easier to find them and exploit them than the usual accounts. Another interesting point is that if you're familiar with Kerberos, those accounts are by default able to be exploited in that way because they must be registered with service principal names, and if they have a weak password, they probably could obtain a service ticket to them and then try to brute force the ticket offline to extract the password again. And if you already compromised the server which they are in, you will probably find the credentials of those accounts in memory because those accounts are always logged on with the service, and the credential will be cached in memory. I wanted to look how in different configurations and how many products and solutions use this kind of configuration the constraint delegation with protocol transition. And I was amazed to see how many vendors, especially security vendors, need that kind of configuration. But basically, it makes sense because any kind of solution which is placed outside of the domain, such as a firewall, but needs to have access to a service that is in the domain, it needs to use this kind of configuration. Let's look for one example how a major vendor that I guess most of you use, which I can't say the name, is using constraint delegation with protocol transition to allow single sign-on with smart card when the clients are not joined the domain. What I see that their best practice configuration, they request that each domain controller must be delegated to with the CIFS, LDAP, and protected storage service principal names. And this was only modified a year ago, so it's not like a legacy thing. So now we know that we have an account which in their security considerations, they don't say that is privileged. So I don't know how they secure it, but is able to delegate access to the Active Directory. So at that moment, I started to think, what is the attack surface an attacker can have once he have this kind of account? How we can leverage those privileges to gain malicious intentions. So first, our attack surface is determined by the attribute in the Active Directory, which is called allowed to delegate to, which contains the list of service principal names that service is allowed to delegate. So the common service principal names I've seen that are used with delegation are HTTP for web services, MS SQL SVC for SQL databases, host for computer management, CIFS for file servers, and LDAP for the domain controllers. So we know that we have a lot of attack surface, there are many servers that use this kind of delegation. So at that moment, I started to think how we can stretch and make malicious activity above the original and the intended functionality. And because service principal names are only restrict service and not a specific usage or to application, it's not so hard to find ways to make more than what the application should have do. So some examples I thought about is first, except from the fact that we can elevate privileges by making arbitrary impersonations with this account, we can also make data exfiltration just by making accessing the application, the file share database that has been allowed to delegate to and extract the data. But more interesting is how we can gain remote code execution. So databases should be used only to retrieve and update data, but actually, if I can impersonate the DBA, nothing stops me from enabling XPCMD shell and then running command through it. So while the application should be only used for SQL, you can run commands to that machine. Also, a nice example is that web services use the HTTP service, but also PowerShell use it, because PowerShell is also running commands through HTTP service, which means that even if you have a web service for IS, you can use PowerShell to execute arbitrary commands. Host is the computer management, which means that you can do whatever you want with it. As the example I showed before, when you have LDAP delegation to the domain controller, you can basically run the DCSync attack to replicate accounts, hashes, and do whatever you want. You basically have a domain compromise at that moment. So let's make a quick recap. First, in order to make the attack flow, we need to hunt an account which is trusted for that delegation, the constraint delegation with protocol transition. Find it in Active Directory, find a way to get to this account. You are the hackers here, find a way. And then when you have the account, impersonate arbitrary users that are allowed for delegation. By default, only the default domain administrator cannot be delegated. So it can be the CEO to access a specific file, or it just can be a domain administrator to elevate privileges and gain access to somewhere. It doesn't really matter. At the end, You just need to access the service with the ticket and do whatever you want, because you can be whoever you want. So I made a tool, and I call it Mystic, on the comics character in Marvel, which could change her shape and impersonate another person. With Mystic, you can find accounts which are trusted for delegation by querying the Active Directory, as well as read delegation flags and attributes. And most importantly, if you have the constraint delegation with protocol transition user, you can use it to impersonate arbitrary users just by supplying the username. You can find this tool in the Black Hat website, as well as in the GitHub page below. This tool is using only built-in functionalities in Windows, so please, you can use it both for the defensive side and the offensive side. Don't make it a virus. I would like to show you a demo how I can leverage a web service to gain remote code execution with PowerShell, and then use Mimikatz to make a DC sync attack and replicate the Kerberos TGT, which can be used then to make golden tickets. This working? It's working? Yeah. Okay, so first we can use define delegation accounts function in Mystic to list all the accounts that are trusted for delegation. As you can see, we have one account here which is trusted for protocol transition, and it can delegate access to the HTTP service on web server and held up to the domain controller. We can see that the SPN is located of the account on a machine called victim. Luckily, somehow we find this account and we are running through it now. If we try with the account as is to invoke a command using PowerShell to that web service through HTTP, let's see what happens. Let's try to make UMI and list the C directory. As you can see, I have an access denied error, which basically means we don't have the sufficient access. Let's try to get the get current identity, which is another function in Mystic to show the Windows token we're running with, who is he. So we can see that we're running with the web service, and in our group membership, we are only member of the domain users group. So maybe this is the reason why we cannot execute command on the web server. But because we are trusted for the constraint delegation with protocol transition, we can basically impersonate another user. Let's try to impersonate another user using the new impersonation command. Wait, I make a new one. Yeah. And let's say that we know the name of the web administrator, which is called web admin, luckily. So now we're just impersonating him. If we use the get current identity again, not this one, we can see that now we are using the web admin, and in the group membership, we can see that we are a member of the web admins group. Let's try to invoke the same command again to try to run command to the web server. And as you can see, the command now works. We can see that in the UMI that we are really the web admin, and we can list the C directory. Let's go back to our original account and try to invoke Mimikatz with the DC sync attack. So what we're basically trying is to replicate the Kerberos TGT account. Wait. Not working. So we are trying to execute the command, trying to replicate the KBTGT hash, and we see that we have an error, which basically means we don't have sufficient access again. We know that this async works with domain admin privileges. Let's use the read delegated flag function in Mystic and map all the user groups, all the accounts in the domain admin group, the domain admins, which allowed for delegation in order to impersonate. So we see that we have two accounts. We are a member of the domain admins. Let's try to take one and impersonate him. So we successfully impersonated the user. Let's try to invoke Mimikatz now again with the right access privileges. So as you can see, we successfully replicated the account, and we have the KBTGT hashes, and now we can make golden tickets. Okay, so if I already convinced you that delegation could be abused for more than what it thinks, I might surprise you, and it's not over yet. Because after my Blackhat submission was accepted, another researcher started to look inside Kerberos delegation, and two brilliant researchers, Alberto Solino, the author of Impacket, and Benjamin Delphi, the author of Mimikatz, found out that basically there is no service principal name validation at all, which means that the whole concept of the constraint delegation is not true. There is the service principal name are not a security boundary, which means there is no service restriction. So what we do have, Kerberos protocol is all about tickets and secret key cryptography. So a service validates a service ticket by making sure it's been encrypted with the right secret key. That key is basically the password hash of the service account, which runs under the service on the remote server. This means, if you think about it, that every ticket that is being encrypted with the same secret key, the same hash, means that they are fully interchangeable. It doesn't really matter if it's for the CIFS, for file sharing, or host for all the computer management. Because computer accounts are already have multiplier SPN registered automatically, and there are many accounts that have multiple SPNs associated to that account, this means that are all interchangeable. Even more, if you have two different accounts, but they have the same password hash, and user accounts by default use RC4 encryption, which is unsalted, means that if you have the same password, they have the same password hash. So if you use some kind of imaging to duplicate accounts, or you have a default password in your organization, this means that even if you delegate access to a specific service, it means that it could also go to the other account which might be on a different server. Let's see an example. So let's say that we are the attacker and we already compromised the front end, but we see that we can delegate access only to the CIFS service on the back end, but we want to gain remote code execution. I don't know a way how we can make a remote code execution to the CIFS service. However, what we can do is to use the service related proxy to get that ticket to the CIFS and then present that ticket to the backend, but requesting the host service. It works because it works when the backend has the same two services associated to this account. It doesn't really matter, it doesn't really care about what is the service principal name that is associated with this account. All that matters is if it's encrypted with the same key. Moreover, we have another service which uses the same account under it. We can use the same ticket and request access using any kind of service we want, as long as they're both under the same account. Microsoft in Windows 2012 do realize that the service principal names are not security boundary, and they invented the resource-based consent delegation with a new attribute, very long, allowed to act on behalf of other identity, which basically means that they are now changing from restricting by per service principal name to the delegating accounts. This attribute is assigned to the backend in front instead of the front end, which means that the backend now have control and decide who is the accounting that can delegate access. However, it's not long works with the service principal name. Another big advantage is now that the resource-based consent delegation can support delegation across domains and forests. So you can have a backend in another branch and you can still delegate access to it. The only requirement in the resource-based consent delegation is that the server, the front end, should use Windows 2012 as well as the DCs that are between. I'm not sure if this is a good thing or a very bad thing, the resource-based consent delegation, when we talk about security, because now there is no service restriction at all. And if the backend already trusts the front end, and we know that the front end cannot be trusted, the attacker can do whatever he wants to that backend. And because now we can delegate access to another domain or forest, this enables an attacker very interesting opportunities for lateral movement and escalation. With all that said, let's talk about defense. So first, I advise for you, for the blue team, to use Mystic to list all the accounts that are trusted for delegation in your organization. If you use, for some reason, the unconsented delegation, change it. Understand the services that you delegate to and change to the consent delegation. If you use protocol transition, check why you need the protocol transition. If you don't have to, don't use it. Another important suggestion is that you need to think that the security level of the front end should be at least as the same as the services that you delegate access to. So if you delegate access to a domain controller, that server should be at the same level of security of the domain controller. And I hope it's a good enough. Detecting this kind of activity through the event logs could be only available from Windows 8 and Windows 2000. And Microsoft improved the successful logon event with new impersonation level attribute. So now you can see the delegating account as well as the delegated account. This log is both on the front end as well as the back end. You can also detect it through network if you listen to the traffic that comes from or to the domain controller by seeing the TGS request and TGS replies in the service related proxy extension. You can detect the service as well as the account that who delegated access as well as the account who's been delegated. So we have multiple choices here. To mitigate attacks, except from the recommendations I gave before, you should configure services, especially in the backend, with a dedicated service account. Don't use the same account for multiple services or for other usages. Also, don't use the computer account because it's mapped with multiple service principal names, and it's very hard to limit that access. Also, to avoid attacks such as Kerberos, you should use a password policy with rotation and complexity. Another option is to set unique service principal name that could be allowed for delegation. Don't use the built-in ones because, as the PowerShell example, one SPN could be used for multiple usages. So if you have an IIS server which is under the computer account, it could also be used for PowerShell remoting. Also, you can specify a specific port number and set the application to listen only to that port number, and in that way, make sure there's no other applications that could be delegated. Other Microsoft options that you can consider is to first use the account is sensitive and cannot be delegated to set to the privileged accounts in your network. However, this restricts the ability to delegate them at all. So if you have a domain administrator that you know that you cannot delegate access to it, that you don't want to delegate access to it, you can set it. Also, you can use the resource-based constraint delegation if you don't really know and follow which are the front ends that delegate access to those backends. You can set this restriction in the backend, and you don't need domain administrator privilege for it. And also, if for some reason you're still using the unconstrained delegation for unnecessary reasons, at least enforce forest boundary restriction to avoid impersonation between forests. So in conclusion, Kerberos delegation is a very powerful feature, and with great power comes great responsibility. You should know that if I'm talking here today about Kerberos delegation and how it could be abused, somebody else is already doing it already. Also, service and service accounts are always a weak point in any organization, and you should know that the risks they introduce are more than what you think. So you should try to limit them as much as you can, because it's very hard to expect and to know what's their real power. And lastly, if you are in the blue team here, I really suggest to check what kind of delegation you use in your network and try to harden it as much as you can. I know it's hard, but it is possible, and it's rewarding. Questions? Yes, please. Yes. So the question is why I should change the password regularly in Kerberos. That's the question? Okay. So basically, service accounts, when they have SPN, if they are based on user accounts which have a weak password and encryption, you can get a ticket for it. And because Kerberos is using secret key cryptography, if the password is weak, you can take that ticket and try to brute force the ticket offline. It's a matter of maximum days. You can use tools like Hashcat and John the Ripper to do it for you. So if you have a long password, it's make it infeasible. So this is why you should change it regularly with complex password. Okay? Yes? Yes. Okay, so the question is how Mystic knows what are the accounts who are trusted for delegation. So yes, it queries the Active Directory with a specific filter, which check the user account controls and attributes to map those accounts, and then get another attributes to give you a good view of the account and what it is capable of. It also been updated with the revelations of Benjamin Delphi and Alberto Solino to also show the extra vulnerable services that might have been because of those accounts. Okay? More questions? Yes? I'm not hearing you. So the question if certificate-based kind of authentication solves this problem. So basically, it's not really Kerberos related. It's different. I'm not sure what specific you are talking about. You can come later. It's different kind in the domain. If it uses Kerberos, it's not using certificates, but we can talk about it later. Okay? Another question? I think not. Okay. Good. So I'd like to thank CyberArk for letting me research stuff that nobody cared about, and Microsoft Resource Center for answering me some weird questions, and of course for Benjamin Delphi and Alberto Solino for the great addition to the constraint delegation exploitation, and finally to all of you for taking delegation seriously. Thank you.